You can't bring Dad back, and my wife's birthday is only once a year." The words tore through the air like a knife, cold and deliberate, leaving the room in stunned silence. I froze in my chair, my heart lurching as if the ground had disappeared beneath me. My son, Derek Johnson, 34 years old, stood tall in his pressed navy suit, his voice filled with arrogance, his eyes daring anyone present to challenge him. His wife, Monique, 32, sat beside him with a smug smile tugging at her painted lips, her perfectly polished nails tapping on her purse in rhythm with my heartbeat. Around us, relatives shifted in disbelief. Pastor Raymond Lewis pressed his lips together with sorrowful judgment, and family lawyer Angela Carter leaned forward, her brow creased as though even she, seasoned as she was, had never heard cruelty stated so plainly. Loretta Johnson, 62 years old, widow of Clarence Johnson, sat in that office still raw from burying my husband just hours before, and now faced a humiliation I could never have imagined. Derek's words were not only a rejection of his father's memory, but a public declaration that my grief, my love, my marriage of 4 decades meant nothing compared to a night of champagne and cake in Florida. His next words came sharper still, slicing through the stunned whispers around us. "Mom, I chose Monique's birthday over Dad's funeral. Stop pretending it matters, and now I need something from you." The audacity knocked the air from my lungs. I stared at the boy I had nursed through childhood fevers, the young man whose tuition I had worked 3 jobs to pay the son Clarence. And I had sacrificed our very health for now, looking at me as if I were nothing but an obstacle in his way. Heat flooded my face, my hands trembling as I pressed them into my lap to stop the shaking. The shame burned hotter than grief, the humiliation of his cruelty echoing in every corner of that room. A cousin gasped softly, an aunt shook her head, and whispers rippled like fire catching dry leaves. Derek did not flinch. He did not lower his voice. He wanted this spectacle. He wanted me broken. Monique's eyes glittered with satisfaction, as if my pain was her entertainment, as if my sorrow was the punchline of a cruel joke. For a heartbeat, I could not breathe. My chest tightened, the weight of betrayal heavier than the casket I had just watched sink into the earth. Yet somewhere deep inside, under the suffocating grief, Clarence's voice stirred in my memory, steady, resolute, reminding me of the strength he had always believed I carried. Derek's cruelty was not a careless mistake. It was calculated. It was the opening shot of a war he and Monique believed I was too old, too broken, too fragile to fight. But as I sat there, every nerve in my body screaming, I knew one truth with terrifying clarity. This was not just about a missed funeral. It was about respect. It was about love. It was about justice. And I would not let my husband's memory or my own dignity be buried alongside him. Before I tell you how far my own son's betrayal went, I need to pause for just a moment and speak directly to you. If you are listening to this right now, please take a second to subscribe to my channel because these stories are real and they matter, and I want to share them with you. And while you are here, tell me in the comments where you are watching from, whether it is late at night in Chicago, early morning in Atlanta, or a quiet evening in Texas. I read every single message because your voices remind me that even when family turns their back, there is still a community that listens and cares. So let's continue, because what Derek and Monique did next cut even deeper than those first cruel words, and you need to hear exactly how far they went. The day of Clarence's funeral was gray heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never released it, as though the heavens themselves withheld their tears. I walked slowly behind the casket, my arm trembling as Pastor Raymond Lewis spoke solemn words about devotion, loyalty, and the fleeting nature of life. The choir hummed softly, the notes lifting and fading like smoke, and I clutched a handkerchief to my mouth to hold back the sobs that wanted to break free. Clarence had been my partner for 40 years, the man who held my hand through every storm, the father who had worked until his back ached and his eyes failed just to give Derek the kind of life he had never known. And yet, when the casket was lowered into the ground, there was an empty space where my son should have stood, no comforting arm around my shoulder. "No," whispered, "I'm here, Mom." Instead, I knew he was hundreds of miles away, laughing over champagne at Monique's birthday party in Florida, clinking glasses with strangers, while I laid his father to rest. That absence cut deeper than any blade, and though people around me tried to console me, the space beside me felt like a wound that would never heal. After the funeral, I returned to our home, and that was when the silence became unbearable. Clarence's shoes still sat neatly by the door, polished like he always kept them. His coffee mug with the faded letters spelling World's Best Dad rested on the counter, a faint ring of yesterday's coffee still at the bottom. The armchair where he read the newspaper each morning waited in the corner, the indent of his body still there as if he had only just stood up. I walked through each room as if entering a museum of memories. In the bedroom, his glasses lay folded on the nightstand beside the novel he never finished. His jacket still hung on the back of the chair, faintly carrying his scent of cedar and aftershave. Every object screamed his presence and his absence at the same time, and I clutched my chest as waves of grief rolled over me, leaving me gasping for air. Neighbors brought food, cousins offered prayers, and Pastor Lewis came by in the evenings to sit quietly. Yet no gesture could fill the canyon of loss stretching inside me. Nights were the worst. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, reaching out instinctively to the cold side of the mattress where Clarence had always slept. I thought about the times we laughed together while folding laundry, the countless Sundays we cooked for the church potluck, the evenings when we sat on the porch watching fireflies as Derek played basketball in the driveway. All of it now felt like a cruel trick played by time, snatched away in an instant, leaving me with echoes that only deepened my loneliness. And just as the sorrow threatened to crush me, the anger began to rise. Anger at Derek for not showing up, for robbing me of the one thing I needed most, his presence to honor his father's memory. Anger at Monique for convincing him that her celebration was more important than our grief. That fury kept me awake, my mind replaying the moment I looked across the graveside and saw the empty space where my son should have been. It was not only Clarence I buried that day. It was the illusion that family always shows up for family, the belief that blood guarantees loyalty. That illusion died with him, and in its place grew a painful truth. I could not ignore sometimes the greatest betrayal comes from the child you gave everything to. When I was a young woman of 22, I married Clarence in a small church filled with friends and neighbors who promised us a future of joy. But joy was something we often had to fight for. We never had much. But what little we had, we poured into our family, and especially into Derek. From the moment he was born, his tiny fists curled around Clarence's finger, we swore to give him every chance we never had. That promise became the driving force of our lives, shaping every decision, every sacrifice, every sleepless night. I remember the winters when Clarence worked at the factory by day and drove cabs at night, coming home with hands so raw from the cold that he could hardly bend them. He would kiss me on the forehead, whisper just a few more years, Loretta, and collapse on the couch before starting all over again the next morning. I worked shifts at the diner scrubbing floors after midnight and took in sewing jobs from neighbors, all to scrape together enough money to send Derek to a private school we could barely afford. Tuition was nearly $12,000 a year, a sum that felt like a mountain, but we climbed it with bleeding hands because we believed our son deserved to stand at the top. I remember selling the piece of land my father had left me, a small patch of soil in Georgia that carried the weight of my family's history. It broke my heart, but Derek needed a car to get to his classes, and Clarence insisted we give him reliable wheels so he could focus on studying instead of worrying about how to get around. That land was worth nearly $30,000, and I signed it away with trembling hands, telling myself it was an investment in my child's future. Then came the time when Derek ran up credit card debt in college, nearly $15,000 on designer clothes and weekend trips. Clarence and I argued for nights on end, my husband pacing the kitchen, his eyes tired and bloodshot. But in the end, we paid it off, cashing out a savings account we had been keeping for a new roof. Rain leaked into our bedroom that winter, dripping through a bucket at 2 a.m. while Derek posted photos online of new shoes and fancy dinners. And still we told ourselves, he's young, he will learn. We just need to give him time. When Derek graduated, Clarence wanted to get surgery for his cataracts. His vision had been clouding for years, and the doctor warned it would only get worse. But Derek came to us then asking for money to start a small company with a friend. Clarence looked at me across the kitchen table, his eyes hazy but full of determination, and said, "I'll wait. Let's give him this chance." We handed over $25,000, every cent of Clarence's retirement account, and pushed the surgery back. Months later, the company folded and Clarence's eyesight dimmed further until he could barely drive at night. I still remember guiding him by the elbow up the church steps, his pride swallowed while Derek shrugged it off, telling us failure was just part of business. Yet Clarence never stopped defending him. "He just needs time," he would whisper. "He'll come around. He'll see what we've done for him." But time passed, and the pattern never changed. Derek married Monique in a lavish wedding that we largely paid for, over $60,000 spent on the venue, the catering, the flowers, all while I patched Clarence's shirts and watched him struggle to read the morning paper. At the reception, I saw Monique's eyes sparkle not with gratitude, but with hunger, as though she had stepped into a kingdom she planned to rule. The more we gave, the more they demanded, and each time I told myself it was love, it was family, it was what parents were supposed to do. But sitting alone after Clarence's funeral, surrounded by unpaid bills and memories of sacrifices that had never been acknowledged, I felt a hollow ache settle in my bones. We had poured our lives into Derek, and in return, he poured contempt onto us. He did not show up when his father was lowered into the earth because to him, our decades of sacrifice could not compete with the fleeting sparkle of Monique's birthday candles. That realization cut me deeper than grief. It was betrayal etched in numbers and deeds in the very fabric of our history. Every dollar spent, every hour worked, every dream postponed, it all stood before me like a monument not to love but to wasted devotion. The very evening after Clarence was laid to rest, when the house still smelled of lilies from the funeral and the casseroles brought by neighbors sat untouched on the kitchen counter, Derek and Monique arrived. They did not come with condolences or quiet support. They came dressed sharply, Monique's heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a metronome of arrogance, Derek carrying a leather briefcase as if he were about to close a business deal. I rose from the couch slowly, expecting at least a word of sympathy, a hand on my shoulder. But Derek's eyes were cold, and Monique's smile was the kind that hides daggers behind glossed lips. He did not ask how I was holding up. He did not mention Clarence's name. Instead, he cleared his throat and said with a rehearsed firmness, "Mom, we need to talk about Dad's estate." My heart lurched. The grave was barely covered with soil, and already my son's mouth was forming words about property, about money, about what he believed was his due. "You can't run the business." Mom Derek continued, his tone firm, almost condescending. "You're 62, you're grieving, you're not equipped. Dad would want me in charge. It's time to hand things over." Monique stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the air, her manicured hand sliding possessively over Derek's arm. "Loretta, you know it's true," she chimed in sweetly, though her eyes glittered with cruelty. "It's Derek's legacy. It's his turn. You can't possibly handle it alone." The words stung more than the funeral hymns had soothed. My voice caught in my throat, but before I could reply, Derek pressed on, pulling papers from his briefcase, laying them on the coffee table, as though this was a boardroom negotiation and not the living room of the house where he had grown up. "This is simple," he said. "Sign over the controlling shares of the business to me, transfer the accounts, and we'll take care of everything. You can keep the house for now." "For now." The phrase hissed in my ears like a threat. Around us, a cousin who had stayed after the funeral gasped audibly, covering her mouth. Pastor Raymond, who had dropped by to check on me, shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowed, his eyes fixed on Derek with silent disapproval. Angela Carter, who had been sorting through Clarence's papers with me earlier, froze, her eyes sharp with disbelief. Yet Derek remained unfazed, his jaw set, his voice dripping with authority he had not earned. I stared at him, my mind spinning with images of Clarence lifting boxes late at night, of myself scrubbing floors until my back ached, of all the sacrifices etched into every corner of this home. And here was my son treating it like a business acquisition. My lips trembled as I finally whispered, "Your father isn't even cold in the ground." Derek's face hardened, his eyes narrowing as though my grief was an inconvenience. "Dad is gone, Mom. Business is business. If you don't act now, everything he built will crumble and it will be on you." Monique tilted her head, her voice honeyed but sharp enough to draw blood. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You'll thank us later when you're not overwhelmed." Overwhelmed! As if my love, my years of labor, my marriage of 40 years could be reduced to an old woman too fragile to matter. The humiliation burned hot in my chest. In front of my family, my pastor, my lawyer, my own son had stripped me bare, not of possessions but of dignity, treating me as though I were a placeholder standing in the way of his inheritance. The room seemed to close in every whisper echoing louder, every face reflecting pity or anger or shock. And I realized then, in that single, cruel moment, that this was not just about greed. This was about power. Derek and Monique had chosen this moment deliberately, believing my grief made me weak enough to surrender. They wanted to crush me publicly to establish control not just over assets, but over me to rewrite the story of Clarence's legacy with themselves as the victors. But as I sat there trembling, something deep within me hardened. They thought they were delivering the final blow, but they had only lit the fuse of a fire I had buried beneath sorrow. They had no idea the storm they had just unleashed. The night after Derek and Monique left my house with their arrogance still lingering in the air, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the papers they had shoved across it, unsigned, their empty lines glaring at me like silent accusations. I traced my fingers over the wood where Clarence and I had shared countless late-night conversations, and I felt his presence as clearly as if he had been sitting across from me. My husband had always been a man of foresight, a man who planned even in the face of uncertainty, and for the first time since his passing, I wondered if perhaps he had left me more than memories. The next morning, I called Angela Carter. She arrived swiftly, her briefcase brimming with documents, her sharp eyes full of resolve. We sat in Clarence's study, the smell of his books still hanging in the air as she opened a sealed envelope he had entrusted to her months earlier. "Loretta," she said gently but firmly. Clarence anticipated this. He left instructions. My breath caught. With steady hands, she unfolded the will, and as her voice carried the words aloud, I felt a wave of both sorrow and relief crash over me. Clarence had made it unmistakably clear Derek was to receive nothing of the controlling shares, nothing of the accounts, nothing of the insurance policies. Instead, the company was left entirely in my hands, the life insurance designated for community scholarships, the home secured in my name. He knew Derek would try. Angela explained, her tone grim. Clarence saw through the pattern long before you wanted to admit it. Tears welled in my eyes as I clutched the document, Clarence's careful script staring back at me like his final embrace. For all the years I had defended Derek, for all the times Clarence warned me of the danger in coddling him, here was proof that my husband had been right, and that even in death he had left me a shield. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I was no longer the grieving widow too weak to resist. I was the executor of Clarence's legacy, the guardian of our sacrifices, and the one person standing between Derek and the destruction he sought. Angela leaned closer, her voice sharp with strategy. "We will restructure immediately. Transfer the insurance into the scholarship fund. Reinforce the business structure under your sole authority. If Derek wants to fight, let him come. He has nothing on paper." For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of power flicker in my chest. I nodded. "Do it. Make it ironclad." Over the next days, Angela and I worked tirelessly. We met with the board of the small company Clarence had built, men and women who had known him for decades, who had watched Derek's entitlement grow like a weed. One by one, they pledged their support to me, signing documents that reaffirmed my control. We visited the bank, closing accounts Derek had tried to access and opening new ones in my name alone. I transferred the life insurance payout into a foundation account, drafting the beginnings of the Clarence Johnson Scholarship, a fund that would send children from our community to college the way Clarence always dreamed. Each stroke of my pen felt like a declaration, not just against Derek's greed, but in honor of the man who had trusted me to carry his vision. Word began to spread quietly through the community. While Derek and Monique whispered about taking over, others whispered about my resolve, about how Clarence's widow was standing tall against betrayal. Pastor Raymond stopped by with a warm smile, telling me the congregation admired my strength. For the first time since the funeral, I lifted my chin without shame. Yet I knew this was only the beginning. Derek would not retreat easily. Monique would not allow him to accept defeat. They had tasted power in their imagination, and people like them did not surrender fantasy without a fight. Still, I felt ready. I felt Clarence's hand on my shoulder steady and unyielding, guiding me through the storm. That night, as I placed the will in the safe, locking it tight, I whispered into the darkness, "Clarence, you were right, and I promise you I will not let him destroy us. Not anymore." At first, Derek and Monique strutted around town as though nothing had changed, boasting about plans to take over the business, whispering in the ears of neighbors that I was too old to manage anything. They carried themselves like royalty in exile, expecting the crown to be delivered any day. But soon, reality began to unravel their fantasy, and it unraveled fast. The bank, armed with the documents Angela and I had executed, froze the accounts Derek had tried to access. He stormed into the branch one morning, demanding his so-called inheritance, only to be told in front of a line of customers that he had no legal claim. Witnesses later told me his face turned crimson. His voice cracked with rage as security escorted him out. That humiliation spread through town like wildfire. Their home, the oversized property they had bought on loans and inflated credit, soon became the first visible casualty. Mortgage payments. Derek had assumed he could cover with my husband's assets suddenly fell behind. Within months, the bank issued foreclosure notices. Neighbors whispered as movers arrived to haul out furniture Monique had flaunted on social media, the velvet sofas, the gilded mirrors, the racks of designer clothes. When the foreclosure sign went up on the lawn, it was as though the entire neighborhood sighed in grim satisfaction. The luxury vehicles Derek had paraded, leased in a desperate attempt to look wealthier than he was, vanished one by one as the repossession trucks pulled them away in broad daylight. Children pointed from the sidewalk, mothers shook their heads, and men who had once respected Clarence muttered that his son had squandered everything. It was not just financial ruin that followed them, it was social exile. Invitations dried up. Old friends stopped answering their calls. Even Monique's fashion circle, once eager to bask in the glow of her curated lifestyle, turned on her. Rumors spread that suppliers refused to work with her boutique after hearing how she encouraged Derek to abandon his father's funeral. If she can't respect family, how can she respect business? One former associate told a reporter. The boutique's sales plummeted, and within 6 months, the store closed its doors. Mannequins stripped bare windows dark. In church, their absence became conspicuous. Pastor Raymond, gentle yet firm, spoke one Sunday about honoring parents, his eyes sweeping over the congregation where once Derek and Monique would have sat in polished arrogance. Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement filled the pews, and though their names were never spoken, everyone knew the message. Even their extended family, once tolerant of Derek's entitlement, grew weary. A cousin refused to lend him money. An aunt told me in hushed tones that Monique had tried to borrow for rent but was turned away. The circle that had once enabled them had finally snapped shut. I did not gloat, though a part of me felt the grim satisfaction of justice unfolding. Each headline, each whispered rumor, each shuttered door was a testament to choices Derek had made, to the arrogance that had led him here. Yet still, I braced myself because pride like his does not crumble quietly. He grew more desperate, more reckless. Monique lashed out online, posting bitter tirades about betrayal, hinting at secrets, calling me a thief. But the community saw through it. They remembered Clarence, they remembered me, and they chose to believe what their eyes could see: a widow standing firm, a son unraveling. One afternoon, I passed by the old house that had once been theirs, now stripped of its lawn ornaments and left in disrepair. A new family was moving in, children laughing as they carried boxes, the sound of life beginning anew. Derek stood at the curb, watching, his shoulders hunched, his face hollow. Monique sat in their dented sedan, her eyes darting away from mine when she noticed me. For a moment, I almost pitied them, but then I remembered Clarence's weary eyes when he postponed his surgery, the nights I scrubbed diner floors to pay Derek's tuition, the empty space beside me at the funeral. Pity dissolved into resolve. They were not victims of misfortune. They were victims of their own greed. It was only a matter of time before Derek tried to claw back what he believed was his birthright. The foreclosure, The repossessions, the social exile had not broken his pride. Instead, he walked into the courthouse flanked by Monique, his chin raised high, a lawsuit filed against me, demanding a share of Clarence's estate. He claimed undue influence. He claimed mental incapacity. He claimed I had manipulated his father into cutting him out. The arrogance of it burned through me, but I walked into that courtroom with Angela Carter at my side, my grief worn like armor, my dignity unshaken. The gallery filled quickly, neighbors, church members, even distant cousins curious to see the drama unfold. Pastor Raymond sat in the second row, his eyes calm but resolute, a reminder that community watched every word. Derek stood before the judge, his voice practiced his suit freshly pressed, though frayed at the edges. He painted himself as a victim, a devoted son denied his rightful inheritance by a manipulative mother. Monique dabbed at her eyes, theatrically whispering into his ear, their performance rehearsed and hollow. But when Angela rose to speak, the entire room shifted. Her voice was clear, commanding, cutting through Derek's accusations with precision. She produced documents signed months before Clarence's death, notarized and witnessed, leaving no doubt about his intent. She produced a video recorded by Clarence himself during a meeting with Angela, where his weary but steady voice declared, "If Derek controls this family, he'll destroy everything I've built. Loretta is the only one I trust to carry this forward." The courtroom gasped. Derek's face drained of color, Monique's jaw tightened, but Angela was not finished. She slid another folder across the table, revealing evidence of forged loan applications. Derek's signature shaky, but unmistakably altered his attempts to leverage Clarence's name for debts without consent. The judge's eyes narrowed, his tone sharp as he questioned Derek directly. Under pressure, his arrogance cracked. His answers stumbled, sweat beading on his forehead. The mask of entitlement slipped, and beneath it lay desperation and deceit. I rose then, my voice trembling at first, but gaining strength with every word. I looked at Derek, my only son, the boy I had held in my arms, the man who now sat exposed before an entire community. "I gave you my life. Derek," I said, the courtroom falling into pin-drop silence. "Your father gave you his sight, his health, his savings. And still, you chose betrayal. You chose yourself over him, over me, over family. This court isn't punishing you. Your own actions are." Derek's eyes darted to the floor, unable to meet mine. Monique shifted angrily, her hand clutching his arm, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The judge's ruling came swift and final. Derek's claims were dismissed with prejudice. He was ordered to pay legal fees, a sum so steep it would bury him deeper in the financial ruin he had already created. The gavel struck, and with it the last shred of his illusion shattered. The gallery murmured, some nodding, others whispering prayers, but I felt no triumph. Only the heavy ache of justice served at great cost. As Derek was led out, Monique trailing behind their heads, lowered, I whispered to Clarence in my heart, "We did it. We protected what mattered." And for the first time since his funeral, I felt the faintest glimmer of peace. When the courtroom doors closed behind Derek and Monique, a heavy silence settled over me, but it was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence of resolution, of knowing the storm had passed and left me standing. The days that followed were filled not with mourning, but with rebuilding. Angela helped me finalize the Clarence Johnson Scholarship, transferring the life insurance into a foundation that bore his name. The first recipients were 3 young students from our community children whose parents had worked the same long hours Clarence and I once had. I sat in the church hall as their names were announced, tears welling as I watched their faces glow with hope. In that moment, I felt Clarence's spirit alive, his legacy transformed into opportunity, his sacrifice blooming into a harvest that would outlive both of us. My home, once heavy with grief, began to breathe again. Pastor Raymond visited often, bringing meals and prayers, but also laughter. I reopened the kitchen to neighbors, hosting Sunday suppers the way Clarence and I had done for years. The sound of pots clanging, the smell of cornbread rising in the oven, the hum of conversation, it stitched life back into the walls. Each evening, I sat on the porch watching fireflies spark against the dark, and for the first time in months, the quiet felt like peace rather than loneliness. Meanwhile, Derek and Monique's descent continued. Without money, without friends, without the safety net they had always assumed was theirs, they drifted from place to place. Their reputation preceded them everywhere. Landlords refused their applications, creditors hounded them, even family stopped answering their calls. Monique, once dressed in designer gowns, now wore bitterness like a shroud, her sharp tongue turning even on Derek. I heard whispers that she left him for weeks at a time, returning only to fight over what little they had. Derek, the boy I once cradled, the man who stood in court with arrogance, was reduced to wandering through town with shoulders hunched, his eyes hollow, his pride shattered. One evening, I saw him outside the church as I was leaving choir practice. He looked older, broken, a shadow of himself. For a moment, I almost reached out, almost called his name. But then I remembered the words he had spoken, the coldness with which he dismissed his father's funeral, the contempt he poured on me when I was most vulnerable. My hand fell back to my side. Some lessons can only be learned in silence. Some bridges burned so thoroughly they cannot be rebuilt. Still, I did not hate him. I pitied him and I prayed for him, but I no longer carried the weight of his choices on my shoulders. That burden was his alone. In the end, I came to understand a truth I had resisted for years. Family is not defined by blood alone. Family is loyalty, sacrifice, respect. Clarence had lived that truth. I chose to honor it. Derek had rejected it, and he would live with the consequences. On the anniversary of Clarence's death, I stood before the scholarship recipients and spoke. My voice was steady, my heart strong. I lost my husband, but I found my strength. Betrayal nearly broke me, but it did not define me. Love, loyalty, and justice defined me. And as long as this foundation stands, Clarence's spirit will guide young men and women toward a better future. The congregation rose to their feet, applause filling the hall, and I felt Clarence smiling in heaven. I walked off the stage with my head high, no longer just a widow, no longer just a mother betrayed, but a woman who had endured, who had risen, who had chosen to build rather than crumble. The story of Derek and Monique ended in shadows, but mine continued in light proof that even in the face of betrayal, dignity and justice can prevail.